So now you've had the hors d'oeuvre. Now for the main meal for this evening, which has been organised and will be facilitated by Medy Hassan. Medy, I think most people will know, is the founder and the managing director of Haus Holdings. He's the co-founder of Vitae Capital and the chair of GenCap Wealth. Importantly for this evening, he's an expert, a passionate expert on innovative commercial strategies, but also on social enterprise. It's an interesting balance, I think. And he brings that perspective to probably one of the very key issues and challenges we face in Australia at the moment, which is our housing crisis. So, Medy, with help from a panel of 4, is going to examine what can be done to overcome barriers and deliver solutions. Medy, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone. This is a crucial discussion. We thought we'd put a spotlight on it today. I'd also like to echo Peter's words around acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and as the traditional custodians of this place we now call Sydney. It's fitting that we are here discussing this topic tonight as we are mid the Homeless Week 2024. The image you see above was taken by myself less than a kilometre away from my home. And I actually live in Brisbane, just to give you some context. While it captures a snapshot of what homelessness may look like, it doesn't fully represent the extent of rough sleeping in our capital cities. And I'm hoping that you'll get a better understanding of what that might mean. Australia's housing crisis has reached a critical point, presenting significant challenges for all of us. Soaring property prices, rapid population growth, and limited investment in social housing are the major contributing factors. Governments and social entrepreneurs have made various attempts to address these issues. Comprehensive reviews of housing policies, increased investment in social housing, sustainable urban development, and measures to curb speculative investment are crucial steps, but they're not enough. Today's discussion will explore potential solutions and pathways to overcome these barriers through the insights of a diverse panel. Our panel includes experts from industry, the Independent Housing Authority, institutional investors, and the social and homeless sector. I couldn't think of a better group of people to have a discussion. Most of the discussions I've been a part of have been just one-sided. It's either been investors or it's been crisis housing, but today I'm actually very excited that we have our wonderful speakers. We will begin with each of our speakers sharing their perspectives on the housing crisis for about 7 minutes each, so it's a bit like speed dating today, followed by a Q&A session with panellists. If time permits, then we'll open it up to the floor. After the discussion, we invite you to join us on the rooftop for drinks. I believe it's open from 8 o'clock. I'm looking at Donald, I think that's the case, where you can meet and chat with our speakers, and certainly after a few drinks, they'll share with you their real feelings towards it. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panellists for the evening and who I would actually call the rock stars for this particular issue. Our first speaker, Rebecca Pinkstone, is the inaugural Chief Executive of Homes New South Wales, a new division within the Department of Communities and Justice. Homes New South Wales is responsible for system stewardship across the affordable, social and homeless sectors to ensure the delivery of more homes and better services for the community. So welcome, Rebecca. Wilhelm Harnisch is an economist, former National CEO of the Master Builders Association and Investment Committee Chair. Wilhelm is also chair of one of Canberra's leading NDIS service providers, Focus ACT. He set up and is chair of a property company, Your Home Canberra, that specialises on designing, constructing and managing accessible dwellings. Welcome, Wilhelm. Our third speaker, Sue Cripps, the Assistant Director at Women's Community Shelters, who will offer important insights into the impacts of the housing crisis through examples of homelessness, innovation, and transitional housing options and crisis accommodation. a really important piece of the jigsaw here today, because we don't actually get to understand what people like Sue has to go through. And lastly, but not least, Adrian Harrington, a funds management institutional investment specialist and former chair of the National Housing and Finance Investment Corporation, otherwise known as NIFIC, now known as Housing Australia, an independent national housing authority that collaborates with the private sector, community housing providers and all levels of government to facilitate and deliver programs that enhance access to social and affordable housing. Thank you for all being here today, and let's begin the discussion. Rebecca, over to you.
First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land, pay my respects to elders past and present, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I wanted to start our discussion off with some reflections. I've worked in housing and homelessness services for over 20 years, and I started in frontline homelessness services in a youth refuge in Fairfield while I was studying political economy at uni. And the thing that I used to say, working in that area, was homelessness isn't just about a house, it's about the wraparound services that people need. I have to say that since I've worked in this area and I've seen the extent of the housing crisis, I actually have flipped that on its head, and it absolutely is about a safe, secure and affordable home. We have a strong homelessness service system that the vast majority of people come and they have a touch point with the homelessness service system. We never see them again. A very small population end up getting entrenched in homelessness, and the current crisis system doesn't work for them, and that's why we have other responses like Housing First. But the thing I really notice in my role at Homes New South Wales, and every night this year we've had on average 3,000 people in temporary accommodation in emergency motel and hotel accommodation across New South Wales. There's no space for them in the homelessness service system, and 20% of them have never been homeless before, and they're working. They just cannot find a place that is affordable to live. So over the 20 years, the crisis in the rental accommodation market, the fact that we now have 30% of people renting and who will always probably rent, combined with policies at a federal government level, mean that more people are actually getting sucked into homelessness and it's harder to get out. So it's an immediate issue for us to address. I've worked in both government and in the community housing sector. I'm excited about this new agency that the government set up, Homes New South Wales, because it really brings together policy, grunt across the sub-market housing system. So social housing, affordable housing and key worker housing, because all of those areas are important and we need a coordinated response. In the last government budget, we were one of the only agencies to get funding. So $6.6 billion of funding to directly invest in the maintenance of current public housing, because actually it's cheaper to maintain the housing that we've got than rebuild it. And then a significant $5.1 billion investment in new supply, new social and affordable housing. We know that the average age of the public housing portfolio is about 50 years, so we've got to get started, we've got to get building. And the thing I'm most excited about is at every point in history when we've had a crisis in the development industry, and I think we can honestly say it's a crisis, we are not seeing the development industry boosting supply. This is exactly the time when the state needs to step in and intervene. So under the GFC, I headed up a program called Nation Building that was directly about intervening in and building more public housing to boost housing supply. And as a result, we saw the private sector, the development industry, also then raise up out of the GFC and start building again. And this is the time now that government needs to step in, use its buying power to start building more social and affordable homes. And I think it'll become a catalyst for the rest of the industry. One other big piece of that building is looking at new methods of construction. So New South Wales has set up a new methods of construction task force. We're the largest investor in a research through the CRC to look at what we need to do as a government authority to really start kickstarting that industry in New South Wales. And that will become a really fundamental part of the way that we deliver the next 8,500 homes over the coming years. So I think it's really, when you look at it objectively, it seems really overwhelming. But I think that there's hope. And by working together, by leveraging government investment, working with industry, boosting our builders and our trades and our developers, but more importantly, putting our tenants and their needs at the heart, I think we're going to see some real change in New South Wales and some investment from the very, very low point that we've had up until this point.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was fantastic. We're going to change gears now to Wilhelm. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Medy, and obviously, it's a solid background in terms of what I want to discuss. Can I just first of all also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here tonight. Look, I'm quite privileged and daunted at the same time talking to such an eminent group of people here. I've sweated over the last 2 months about how I'll prepare this, and literally this is about my 6th version, and I'm about to give you my 7th version. Look, I'm going to look at it from a policy perspective and also an economist. You can't get the economist out of me. And I've been in the public housing space, for those of you who don't know me, and housing for at least 30. Which is quite remarkable. I'm only 32. I started young, as they say. Look, tonight's conversation is really about identifying solutions and pathways and barriers. And the focus certainly will be from an industry and an investment perspective. In my short conversation here tonight, I really want to punctuate the headlines and all the normal solutions that have been proffered as the way forward. I just want to look more at the structural issues that are underpinning the housing crisis. It's been in the making for at least 3 decades, and unfortunately those problems have been well documented in the hundreds of reports and the thousands of solutions that are there, but unfortunately governments have chosen to be inactive in that particular space. I agree in the short term, there are urgent responses needed to increase supply. Of that, there's no doubt. But what we need to do, obviously, in the short term is address skill shortages, land releases, zoning, approval times, and the ever-increasing cost of construction. They're all well-known ones. But I want to really address the underpinnings of to those problems. So I want to focus on the less talked about issues, the role of leadership, the imperative for collaborative federalism, the unlocking of private capital for social housing, democracy and NIMBYism, and in the end, it's all about money. But let me give some context. You've heard about homelessness, which is a real problem and something I fully support and have done for a long time. When I was in the Commonwealth housing area, it was one of my areas that I specialised in. So we have a housing crisis, and everyone says we need more supply. But what do we need more of, right? More of what? So I just want to get you to think about housing in the broader dimension. You know, housing can be bricks and sticks to a builder, shelter for homeless people, accommodation, temporary and long-term rental for students and low-income households. It's about affordability and somewhere to live securely. It's about emergency housing to provide security and safety for women escaping domestic violence or abuse. It's about home ownership. So that's a major focus of most governments, about home ownership. But at the same time, it's an investment vehicle for retirement planning in achieving financial independence. And it's also an asset class for fund managers where the focus is on return of investment, and comes back to about perhaps why private investor or the private asset or fund managers are perhaps not as enthusiastic about putting their money in terms of social housing. So let's talk about leadership. Here I really want to acknowledge the federal government's National Housing Accord with a target of 1.2 million well-located dwellings. It's a great platform to pivot other reforms. But I want to take things that we don't talk often enough, and that is about the structural problems that are at the very core of cost pressures, housing stress, and the broader societal pressures that result in homelessness, domestic violence, and all sorts of other unattainable, affordable accommodation. So let's talk about leadership. What we need, and what's been absent in my view, is that we need leadership at all levels of government. Leadership at industry level and leadership at the community level. We need to come together. I think that's very absent at the moment. There's a lot of mouthing about we need to fix the housing crisis, and yes, extra funding is desirable and to be applauded, but really leadership demands objective and evidence-based public policy reforms, something we haven't seen in a long time. My view, activism and populism are not a substitute for the difficult evidence-based public policy reforms. And for politicians, acquiescing to populism is not leadership. Let me talk about the imperative collaborative federalism. On my wish list is for the 3 layers of government under our federal system of government to align and synchronise the pursuit of agreed housing objectives and outcomes. Surely that's not too much to ask in a clever nation like ourselves. There's a myriad of federal, state and local government policies and regulations laid over many decades that combined have compounded the housing crisis faced today. So the challenge is how do we lessen that, how do we unravel it in terms of fixing the problems in a structural sense. You know, the regulatory intervention over time, however well-intentioned, by definition adds to delay and cost. But really the question we now ask as a society, are the costs worth the intended benefits that they were intended to put in place? Let me spend some time on unlocking private capital for social housing. It's well known that the community sectors for decades have called for injection of private capital for social and affordable housing. Now, the extra funding for social and affordable housing is urgently needed. The current government funding is arguably insufficient, regardless of the big increase in funding. But the rising costs and how the monies are actually expended can blunt the intended impact of the extra funding. For me, the question is, are taxpayers getting the best value for the government funding dollar? In my view, there is considerable scope to radically reform the delivery and asset management framework for delivering social housing and other similarly public funded accommodation, and to drive the funding dollar further. I know that's fairly controversial, but certainly in the ACT, where I live, we have at least 3 different ministers and 3 different departments managing social housing, and no wonder we have a crisis in the ACT. So coming back to the private sector or the private capital. So what is the reluctance of private capital to enter the social housing space? To be blunt, private capital looks at risk and return on investment. The private sector is largely unable to control the regulatory and management risk of the social housing sector. That risk can only be borne by governments. Similarly, social housing, by its very nature, poses a substantial return on investment risk, and once again, that risk can only be borne by government, that is the taxpayer. So how do we solve that? What might encourage more private investment? In my view, at the macro level, taxation and levies imposed on developers and investment funds need to be more accommodating. Capital is highly mobile and unfortunately is increasingly deployed overseas. I was talking to some developers in Melbourne where the monies they were going to put into housing has gone overseas because they're getting a much better return. So in Australia, capital is a major problem. That means that capital is no longer available to developers and house builders. That's going overseas. I want to talk about democracy and NIMBYism. Australia enjoys the benefits of living in a modern democracy, and aren't we privileged to do that? We have robust and transparent institutions that protect people's rights. The rights of individuals and communities in the urban context is absolutely acknowledged. But the rights of future generations and people who are disadvantaged must also be protected. Now, I acknowledge this is a difficult political challenge, balancing the rights of individuals and residents and local communities against making decisions for the greater good of the broader community whose needs are equally deserving. Let me finish on the last issue, which is money. The major influence on housing sectors is fiscal and monetary policy, whether that's for public housing and private. Without going into any detail, there's agreement that the two settings, fiscal and monetary policies, are currently not aligned. One only has to read the RBA's comment following yesterday's meeting of the Reserve Bank. Now, this has seen the cost and availability of finance for construction, home purchase being negatively impacted. Then on top of that, at the consumer level, responsible lending rules make it more difficult for low to middle income households to secure enough borrowing to enter the ever-increasing cost of home ownership. For developers, banks are reluctant to lend. So what's happening is that developers and contractors have to resort to mezzanine borrowing, and obviously that just increases the cost of housing. So in conclusion, in the short term, we need urgent response now in terms of skill shortages, land releases, zoning, the long approval times and the cost of increasing construction. In the longer terms, government must tackle the structural problems, in my view. Yes, in the short term, you can reduce costs by subsidies, but merely masks and ignores the structural and policy problems. It does little to expand housing choices. It simply kicks the can down the road to another housing crisis sometime in the future. What the federal government National Housing Accord has done is to coalesce in a coordinated way a concentrated effort in a federal system of government. It is a good start. But can I quote Oliver in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist novel and plead, please, sir, I want some more. I want some more serious reform that increases supply and that reduces the regulatory impost and cost. All governments need to act as enablers and not blockers. Local government in particular need to act more positively as enablers and blockers. Action is what is needed. They need to say yes more often and not hide behind the cumbersome and ineffective laws and regulations as the excuse for inaction. Can I just say the industry, including the financial sector, will respond positively and help meet the target of 1.2 million dwellings, and also assist the social housing sector in meeting their needs. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Always sobering listen to Wilhelm. I've known him for nearly 2 decades and I'm always sober. Sue.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, this wonderful venue, and to actually have a chance to share some thoughts and history and what have you with you all. In starting, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people, whose land that we're meeting on, and pay respects to any Aboriginal people who are here today. Tonight, I'm actually going to, my background, if you've read our little bios, I have done a lot of work in the advocacy space, in the direct service delivery space, in the homelessness space, never run a housing service, but always worked so very, very closely at that junction and that intersection. And so tonight, I'm going to try and put that human face, that human story that underpins things like that tent, but more importantly, I'm going to be talking about the story that Women's Community Shelters, where I'm doing work at the moment, has really been leading on, I think, in terms of working and partnering and collaborating to create some really innovative ways to try and crack, for the short to medium term, this intolerable issue, which is this housing crisis that I was a lobbyist 20 years ago and I knew exactly. I was there lobbying, saying this is coming, this is coming. So let's start to just put a bit of colour and a bit of structure around this topic that we're here to talk tonight. You know, you can't help, and that picture is a good picture in one sense because it shows it's a very visible representation of that homelessness story, but it is a minute part of that homelessness story. And, you know, yes, they are people, when you're rough sleeping like that, you are at a really crunchy, critical, terrible point in life. But it isn't the only thing that we need to try and focus on if we're going to really start to make some change and some difference. And, you know, data is always a beauty and a terror, because when you're trying to actually explain that homelessness story, it can be really hard because the most reliable data, and it's terribly unreliable, is the census data. So the data I'm actually going to just share with you now is that 2021 census data, which is probably really undercooked, I would say now, given the crisis that we are in. But this data in itself tells a shocking story. So in the 2021 census, 122,494 people were homeless during that census count across Australia. That is a lot of people, and we know that that is undercooked. 1 in 7 people experience. So what else can we tell us about that homelessness story? So we start to unpack and explore that number. 1 in 7 people experiencing homelessness are children under 12. Children under 12. So this is their formative years. They are not safe, not secure. 23% of people experiencing homelessness are children and young people between 12 and 24 years. So again, those formative years where you're looking at getting prepared to be a contributing citizen in society, going through school, getting your jobs, all that sort of stuff. 1 in 5 people experiencing homelessness are Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. And as I started out, homelessness is not rooflessness. About 6% of those people that we count as homeless are in that rough sleeping. Critical 6%, because they are incredibly traumatised and troubled, but still it's a small part. So I don't need to talk about the dysfunctional housing system. We've already had Beck talk about that, and Wilhelm sharing some thoughts, very cogent thoughts on that and why we are where we're at. And so I'm going to talk about what Women's Community Shelters' story is, and in terms of this piece of work. Our crisis shelters often at capacity with delays in securing housing exit points due to that lack of housing supply. So if you can't put a woman into safe housing after she's come in from a crisis situation, it would be criminal to then exit her into homelessness. But if we don't exit them into housing that is not safe, secure and sustainable long term, that then means that there's no entry points into the crisis system to get the support that you need to actually heal and deal what you need to deal with. So whilst we really strive not to exit our women and kids, if they have kids, into crisis, into homelessness, it's a real challenge, and it really basically tells a real story about how we started to explore and think about other ways of innovating. So we've been doing some really good stuff since 2018, and we did this in partnership with property owners, property developers, and community housing providers. And Bridge Housing was our first community housing partner, hey Beck, when Beck was there. Started to really think through and look at what could be done with those properties that are out there, either sitting vacant just because they're sitting vacant, but more importantly, those properties that are there that become vacant as part of being stuck in a planning redevelopment cycle. And there are plenty, as Adrian will also back, of properties out there just sitting, waiting to be developed. So we call that meanwhile use housing. It's a term I think that came from the UK, is where that term came from. Let me explain what that actually is. So it's basically how you look at taking those vacant or underutilised properties. And at the moment, we have done work in that aged care facility space. You can look at hospitals often have space that is not being used, church-owned buildings, properties land banked as part of major infrastructure developments and government assets. And look at how that can be made into immediate housing solutions. And it's one way of starting to look at an interim solution to the issue around getting that supply of secure permanent housing back into the market. Because we know it's great that there's government investment, it's great that there's a federal accord, but to actually build those houses, it's going to take time because we have so many that we need. So 2017 we started our Meanwhile Use project, and it was called then Pathways Home. And we did this in partnership with a developer, fantastic mob called the Pace developers, and through their foundation and Bridge Housing. And we were able to deliver additional transitional housing for women and children exiting crisis accommodation. So just what I was talking about. Nowhere to go into our program. So what it did was this program utilised 5 vacant properties that were land banked for future development. So Pace was doing a major piece of infrastructure development. And they'd bought streets and blocks of land here, there and everywhere. And there were lots of houses on that land. And we actually worked with them and we utilised 5 vacant properties. Bridge Housing became the community housing provider that did all that tenancy and sort of asset management for us, and created a really safe home, transitional home, admittedly, but for 18 months, up to 2 years, to help us work with women and kids to actually help them work on their issues and secure permanent housing. And what that did during that process is we actually developed this really cost-effective and replicable transitional housing model. So from that, we have gone on and we have developed over the time 7 Meanwhile Use projects. We currently have 3 very active multi-tenancy projects in action, delivering that transitional housing solution. And they're part of the properties that we're actually working with at the moment are part of the residential aged care system. And, our partners here are Twilight Edge Care, B Projects, and our community housing providers, Link Wentworth and Pacific Link Community Housing. And at any one time, those 3 projects that we have going are supporting 40 older single women. They have to be older because to meet all the planning constraints without having to do too many tweaks, because it's part of aged care, so women have to be in that aged care bracket. That's okay, because older women are the largest group of growth in the homelessness space. So we're definitely meeting demand in that space. So over the last 4 years, we've accommodated about 120 women in our meanwhile use projects, and that's about 40,000 bed nights over that time. 40,000 bed nights in safe, secure bedroom. Average age of women was 64 years. Our oldest celebrated her 84th birthday just this year. My goodness. Main presenting reason was housing affordability or financial issues, with 51% of our women presenting with that as their primary issue. No other issues. Affordability, financial insecurity. Main sources of income was the age pension or the disability support pension. What have we learned over these last 5 years that are critical factors if we really want to establish this successful meanwhile use project? First off, establishing a meanwhile use project requires strong project management. A lot to do to get a property into a state that is fit for purpose, for living in comfortably and safely. And let's not forget, these are properties that are sitting vacant waiting to be renovated, so they're not in prime, pristine condition in any way, shape or form. Developing that shared vision about purpose and the passion that you need to have to energise it and to get it going is really critical to be able to use that property well. Property has to be available for at least 2 years because the amount of effort and investment that goes, it's just not viable to actually deliver the product, to deliver the end product if you're not going to have it for at least 2 years to be able to house clients in that property. Saying that though, one of our current projects that we thought we would have for 2 years, by the time it's finished, this is in Beecroft, we will have had for 6 years. 6 years is pretty damn good for creating housing, safe, secure housing solutions for older women. Owner goodwill. So property provided, we've got to have it at no or low cost. It's a key factor if we're going to make this projects viable, because this comes with no money to actually do this. It's about how you get out there, how you innovate, how you create pro bono relationships, support partnerships, how you actually deliver ways of getting all the services in that you need at minimal or hopefully no cost. And from a housing provider perspective, they do this because they're passionate about getting people housed and keeping people safe. You don't, when you were Bridge, you didn't make a profit out of any of this work. You probably didn't even cover costs in terms of your staffing dollars. So I think, we have to be really upfront and be very pragmatic about that. This isn't about making money. This is about actually doing really good, joyous things that make a real difference for vulnerable people. The other thing that's really, really critical, you can't do this sort of work without having a strong community behind you. Supporters of your organisations, but also supporters in that community who actually see that this is a good thing in their community, to be supporting vulnerable people and wanting to actually engage with and support that community. Because what we have seen again through our projects is the joy that communities bring to our women in our properties that we currently have, when they come in and they bring in meals or they bring in beautiful hand crocheted blankets and stuff like that, making women feel really welcome and safe in that community. So some critical things. Having really strong partnership with the community housing provider. Because again, Wilhelm, you were talking about policy and all that sort of stuff. If you don't have the support service and the community housing provider sharing the same values with some agreed practice approaches, of course, clients are going to fall through all sorts of cracks, all sorts of mayhem is going to erupt, because that's just the organic nature of this sort of work. Clients also need to be able to live independently with minimum support. This is not a crisis model. It's a housing model. It's a transitional housing model. So this is not for people, for our women, when they are in that acute crisis phase. Of course they're going to have crises, but they're human, right? Throughout their stay. But this is really about people who are not in acute crisis and have some structure and safety and strategy and planning around how they live their life, so that we can manage to help support them into that next step. Town planning. Ugh. Significantly challenging, and I'm sure we could talk more about that as we go, and I know Adrian will too. But I hope in this little bit, what I've done is really communicated how passionately Women's Community Shelters feels about meanwhile use as a really sensible approach that must be better utilised if we're going to do anything in the short to medium term to address this housing crisis, because our women can't wait for the houses to be built. And to finish, I'm going to share a story because I love sharing what we do. And Sue, not me, a woman called Sue, moved into one of our projects last year. She was 65 years of age. She'd found herself unable to find accommodation that she could afford, and she ended up living in her car, 65. 65. And she was interviewed for the ABC's The Drum and was asked how, after years of working in aged care and disability, she'd ended up homeless and having to move into transitional housing into one of our projects. And her response? Divorce. Divorce does it. You don't have much to begin with because you have time out to have children. So you don't build up super. You're always giving the kids money, giving to everybody. And this is how you end up in this situation. I couldn't believe that places like this existed. When I came here first, they said, go to the donations room. There's all these clothes and shampoo and things that women in our circumstances go, what, for us? It was a beautiful message of, yeah, you're worth it. You are worth it. In 4 months, I've made so much progress. I'm going to get a tattoo done that says, eat my fear. I'm one of the lucky ones. I'll get some money for my divorce settlement and be able to get some accommodation. These places are so few, and we need so many more of them. And that's out of the words of another great woman called Sue.
You're going to sit.
See you too.
There we go. Yeah, we're bookending. So Medy, everyone who knows Medy knows that he loves a little bit of controversy. He loves a bit of debate. He loves opinionated people. It's now on the public record. No. So normally on a panel it's good if people actually disagree and there's a bit of argy-bargy and people share different views. But as the last speaker, all I can say is I totally agree with everything that's been said tonight. I guess from my experience, I have a very different perspective to this because I've come from the funds management world. And I had the pleasure of being an inaugural director of NIFIC, which the federal government, the Liberal Party, set up in 2018 and then for a couple of years, and then I became the chair of it. And NIFIC was set up to really allow institutional investors to come in and invest in this sector, partnering with community housing providers such as Bridge, and that's where I got to know Rebecca when she was the CEO, and working with government. And that partnership of institutional capital, partnering with the community housing sector and government can make a difference. Unfortunately, there just hasn't been enough money put in by government. And our institutions are talking about it. They did do some good things. We issued about $2.8 billion worth of bonds in my time on NIFIC, which is now called Housing Australia, and they were sold to both domestic and global institutions, and that gave 10 and 12-year low interest debt to the community housing sector. So that was a tangible number. But what I say to people is that this is a housing crisis, but it's not the first housing crisis we've had, unfortunately. And you go back to some people in this room would have been young at the time, but when we were coming out of World War II, we had the Post-War Reconstruction Authority got set up. And in 1944, the federal government set up the Housing Commission. And I actually found the annual report the other day in the National Library. It's been scanned. In it, they predicted that at the end of the war, they would have a housing shortfall of 300,000 dwellings. You think of how big the market would have been back then. So what did the federal government do? They pumped huge amounts of money. They basically developed suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and all our capital cities and in some of our regional areas to provide accommodation for the soldiers returning from war. And then we saw a massive increase in home ownership. So it has been done before and it needs to be done again because people at the moment aren't going to stump up the money that's needed. The shortfall in housing that we have is massive. And even if the government and under the Accord, and Wilhelm mentioned the 1.2 million, I don't know any person who's forecasting, whether it's the Housing Industry Association, the NBA, some of the economists at the major investment banks, no one's got anywhere near 1.2 million in their forecast. The most I've seen is about 940,000 dwellings. We have to, at the moment, to meet that target, build 250,000 dwellings, 240,000 dwellings a year. We've only done that, got close to that in 1 year, 2017, when we did 230,000 dwellings. At the moment, we're lucky to be doing 160,000 dwellings a year. So the shortfall's actually going to get worse. So that's sort of one point I'd make. The second one is, interestingly, this is not just confined to Australia. This is a global crisis. It doesn't matter whether you go in the US, in Joe Biden, in the State of the Union address back in February, actually mentioned housing as a key issue over there. And I've talked to people in the US, they can't remember the last time a president talked about housing in a State of the Union address. In the UK, it was at the last election they've just had a month or so ago, it was a massive issue, housing. So it is a global crisis, and every country's got different policies and things like that, but we should just put that into the context. The third thing I'd say is that you hear a lot of debate coming up to the election. I cannot believe that we have three of our key parties, the current Labor Party, the Coalition and the Greens, who are absolutely at odds with the solutions to the housing crisis. Labor is pumping money into social and affordable housing through the Housing Australia and the Housing Australia Future Fund. That's $500 million a year. It's a drop in the ocean. And they've got some other programs. The Liberal Party's focused on home ownership, and Senator Bragg, who's now the Shadow Minister for Home Ownership, believe it or not, they've created that role, is trying to stop tax reform to allow global investors and to invest into Australian residential property and the industry super funds to invest in it, because there's an ideological view that we don't need rental accommodation, they want people into home ownership. And I'll come back to why that's an issue in a moment. And then we've got the Greens. The Greens are going to be amazingly vocal about housing at the next election. It's resonating with young people in inner city. So Labor, the Liberals had the Teals at the last election on climate. Labor's got the Greens on housing. And with the Greens want to do rental caps and all sorts of things about the rental market. And that is resonating with young people because they're lining up, every Saturday morning, 60 people lining up to get an apartment. So all of them have got different policies. I just find it extraordinary because when you go on to education and health, there's very little differences between the parties on their policy platforms. Housing, education and health are the three foundations of society. The fact that we cannot get our federal parties to have a bipartisan approach on housing just like they do on health and education is an absolute disgrace. The fourth thing that I guess clouds a lot of the discussion about the housing sector and the solutions for it is we don't know whether it should be a social infrastructure that provides a shelter over everyone should have tonight be able to live in a safe, secure place, no matter whether they're in crisis accommodation right up to they fully own their own home. Everyone should, it's a basic human right to have shelter. The issue is then, you see people look at it through a social lens and say, well, we can't have, you've got to look at it from a social policy point of view. The problem is, particularly in Australia, It's also economic infrastructure. It's a key part of our financial services system. Our banks are the most leverage of any banking system in the world to residential property. So as a result, everyone says, well, it'd be good if house prices came down because that'll make it more affordable for a cohort of people. If property prices fell by 30% this year, could you imagine what would happen to CBA, Westpac, NAB and ANZ shares? Because they would be calling in. There'll be so many people's mortgages called into default. So how do you balance that thing of making property more affordable when our banking system and our financial system, we're so leveraged to residential? And obviously then you've got private investors who are relying on rents and things as an investment property. And they want to put the rents up because they get a better return, etc., etc. But at the same time, you've got people saying rents should come down to make it more affordable. So how do you get that balance? So that issue between what are the policy levers that you need to provide to maintain property as part of the financial system versus the policies and solutions you need to maintain property as a social infrastructure. And that is a very hard balancing act to do. The final thing I'd say is that institutional investors, and Wilhelm touched on it earlier, in the US pension funds have roughly, of their property portfolio, have about 20% invested into rental accommodation, either multifamily, which is apartments, or single families. So office property is about 7 to 8% of the real estate allocation of a US pension fund. In Australia, less than 1% of Australian super funds invest in residential property. And we've actually got global institutions wanting to invest in Australian property, but there's all sorts of tax issues and things like that at the moment that makes it less attractive. So our Aussie super funds, those that are actually investing in the sector, most of their allocation to residential real estate is actually into the US and the UK market than the Australian market. That is starting to change, and obviously the Housing Australia Future Fund, and we're seeing more partnerships through Housing Australia, which, as I said, when I was on the board of NIFIC, which we started to do that. But institutions do have a role to play, but the problem is here the yields are so low, they can get a better yield return out of the US and the UK, so they go there. So it is an interesting dynamic. There are multiple levers that need to be pulled, and we just need to treat this crisis like we did with COVID. We had governments making decisions for the short term to get us through it. And, I'm dealing a lot with Sue at the moment because I chair a thing called Housing All Australians. And what we're trying to do is find some of these vacant properties and bring the property sector in to pro bono, whether it be skills or materials, to fix them up and hand them over. We've identified 5 aged care facilities in Sydney and the Hunter and Central Coast area that are sitting there vacant tonight. And the zoning says it's over 55s. Now, Sue has touched on that lovely story of the other Sue, who was in her 60s. So if we did a meanwhile use property there tonight for them, that would tick the box. The amount of women that are aged between 25 and 44 that actually need a home is huge. New South Wales, the councils and New South Wales planning said, you can't, it's only over 55, so we can let you change it to meanwhile use, but you can only have women there or men over the age of 55, which is ridiculous. My solution, we just put one line into the Planning Act that says if that facility meets all the compliance requirements, sprinklers and things like that, and it is used for meanwhile use to a registered community housing provider and a registered group like Women's Community Shelter, we can use that facility. We don't need to go through a changing thing. And the planning department says, oh, well, every property is different. And I heard this today from them. Every property is different. We need to treat it on a case-by-case basis. We cannot do it. I know, working with Women's Community Shelter and getting the property sector to come and donate their time and money, that tonight, if we did this, within 6 weeks, we could have 250 rooms available for people like Sue's organisation, just by a simple, and I've said to the government, just put it in, change that policy for 3 years. Just get us through this crisis. We did so many other things in COVID. This is a crisis. This is not just a housing cycle boom and bust bit. It's very different. And that's the thinking we've got to get through. We need radical leadership, and Wilhelm touched on it, to make these changes and get rid of the bureaucracy, because it is just creating so many roadblocks to practical solutions to deal with the crisis. And otherwise, we're going to have a societal issue. There's not going to be a 1 or 2. This is a 3, 4, 5 year that's going to have ramifications into the long-term future, because as we hear kids in trying to find a home tonight, what impact is that going to have on their learning abilities, their view of society, the way that society is treating them? How are they going to react to that?
Excellent.
Thanks, Adrian. Look, we're going to open up to questions. I might start with a question. I'm actually going to go off script here a little bit, and then send out questions from the audience and reel in a couple of questions at the tail end. But those who know me, I'm a scorecard sort of person. I sort of like to get a feel for, how people feel about things. And I asked Sue as she walked in, I said to her, how do you think give me a score out of 5 on how we're dealing with this crisis from her perspective? So I'm going to ask the question of each of the speakers. Out of 5, how do you think we are dealing with this crisis through your lens?
So shall I say what I said last time? Right, well, I feel like my years as a lobbyist setting up Homelessness New South Wales and being on that front line in direct service delivery, we are worse than ever, and I think we are lucky if we can say we're a 1 out of 5 in terms of actually having innovation and real solutions on the table actually that are going to make a difference.
Rebecca?
I'm an optimist.
Good on you.
I would say 3 out of 5. Not because I see that there's real potential. I think Adrian's talked about Housing Australia. I think it is a positive direction. I think there is a role for government to play as an aggregator of institutional capital into the sector. But I mean, I think the absolute failure that we have in Australia is the ability to address negative gearing. And that policy setting is by far the worst policy setting if you want to have an equitable housing system, because it encourages speculative investment in housing, and it encourages people to go down a pathway of that as an investment class over other options, and it also skews what some of our industry super funds are investing in as well. So there's many implications of that. But I think Housing Australia is the right direction. 500 million a year is not enough in terms of investment to get any real change. We're seeing the changes at a state level in terms of investment, and I think that there is a momentum for change to think outside the residualised system that we have at the moment for public housing and social housing. I think there is a momentum to say we need to look at mixed tenure. You can't keep residualising a system and expect it to pay for itself. We have to have things like affordable housing in the mix. So I'm feeling more positive, but not overly, maybe 2.5 out of 5.
I mean, I'm with you. I know what you're saying, Beck. I know what you're saying. But I suppose, I'm sorry, I'll shut up in a minute. But like all these years, you just see, and listening to Adrian, what you were saying around the fact that, none of the parties are actually lined up in terms of that agreement on policy position. It makes housing such a vulnerable asset, such a vulnerable product. And I can't
get enthusiastic about...
Football.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, shut up now.
Political football.
I'm certainly an optimist. In one of the many sort of presentations I wrote, I finished up, I'm an optimist. And I'm an optimist because, one, from an industry perspective, the industry can deliver, but it's got to be allowed to deliver.
Yeah.
And we've got to peel back some of the regulations. Maybe we can do, as been suggested, have a 3-year hiatus where the local governments can play their role and say yes more often. I mean, that example of the aged care one is really a tragedy. I mean, you know, how can you... I mean, I just shook my head when I heard that, Adrian. I just find that something that just unbelievable that's occurring in our society today. Just to be controversial, to focus purely on negative gearing as the solution to our housing crisis, I think belies the more structural problems that we are facing. I agree that negative gearing needs to be looked at, but then to say that the solution to solving our supply problems is removing negative gearing, I think is looking at the whole and not at the donut. 2 out of 5.
Yeah, I'm a 2 out of 5. I'm an optimist as well, and that's why I'm playing such a role to try and...
2 out of 5 is not an optimist.
No. Where I'm going to at the moment, we're 2 out of 5 because you asked where are we at the moment. I think in the next couple of years, if we came back here in 2 years' time, I'd probably be going to 3.5 to 4. The reason is because I think now it is starting to resonate. Because the why I say that is, 4 years ago, you would have gone to a dinner party on a Saturday night, red wine sitting at the table, and everyone would go, "Do you see what that house down the road sold for? My house must be worth X." Now the conversation is, how are my kids going to afford a house? How are my kids going to live in this city? We've got the Productivity Commissioner saying that we're going to have kids are going to have to move out of Sydney because they can't afford to be here. We are now, and the election is going to galvanise, I think, the housing debate. And off the back of that, and some of the initiatives that Housing Australia is doing, we've just seen the Minns government come out and some of the stats that Rebecca spoke about. So I think there is momentum building, and I think we are getting there. But the problem is we've got a very inelastic supply chain. So the ability to be able to deliver, and as I said earlier, the 1.2 million is a great optimistic viewpoint, but everyone you talk to says it's not achievable at the moment. We are going to need to break down the barriers. So I think it's 2 at the moment, but I'd like to be able to come back in 2 years and say we're 3.5 to 4 and we're heading somewhere.
So would I.
And just on the issue of negative gearing, the other thing I think we've got to start to think about is we need the institutions to provide the rental stock and not rely on mum and dads. It was fine when we had 3-storey walk-ups. And who's owned an apartment in a 3-storey walk-up? I have. Who was on the body corporate? I was. All I had to do was worry about who came and mowed the front lawn and did the lights going down the hallway work. You've got all these major buildings now being built that are 30, 40 storeys. They've got HVAC systems. They've got lifts, all of that. These body corporates they've got people who are owners or either owner-occupiers or investors sitting on the corporate body corporate to make decisions about how that building should be managed and operated. We're going to see so many issues in these buildings in the next 5 to 7 years as they start to deteriorate. Go and see what Mirvac, Stockland, GPT, Lend-Lease do with all these office towers. The amount of structured asset management programs they have, the amount of money that they spend every year on maintaining those office buildings to a standard, I don't think we have enough oversight of what's going on in these large apartment blocks that have been building. And I actually say to people, do not buy in an apartment block that's more than 10 storeys, because the issues you're going to have and your strata fees down the track and sinking funds not being capable, and that's why we need institutions to come in and provide the rental stock, because there is a part of the market that will always rent. And not just institutions, community housing providers like the Bridges, the St George Community Housings, etc., because we can't rely on mum and dad investors to provide the quality rental stock that we need going forward.
Great, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, that's how you generate controversy. You ask a score. Now, we have world-class mathematicians as part of the society. I don't think you need to be one to work out what the average there was. But it sets a benchmark, I think. It certainly sets the context of the problem that we have. We might open up to the floor now, if there's any questions.
It's neither desirable nor necessary to criticise what's been presented because we've heard about the housing crisis. You said you were a scorecard person. I'm an output person. So would someone care to tell me how many houses have been built in the last 2 years? How much social and affordable housing has been built in the last 2 years?
For New South Wales, I would say, the New South Wales government delivered 720 dwellings last year. The community housing sector combined did around 900. So tiny. And I would say the year before that would have been less because actually it was the federal government investment in the social housing accelerator that has prompted that growth. In New South Wales, social housing is now less than 4% of the housing market. It's gone from 7% to 4% in the last 25 years. And there was no funding. The way that social housing has been funded in New South Wales for the last decade has been through the sale of public housing. That's how new developments were funded. So this funding that we have at the moment is around additional money on top of that to build 8,500 new homes. But up until that point, we've been, it's like a snake eating itself to create more social and affordable housing. Compare that in, the 60s or 70s where New South Wales government was the largest land builder, home builder in the state. So in 25 years, we've gone backwards as a proportion.
Just on that one, one of the deep concerns I've had for a long time looking at social and affordable housing is when you look at the numbers, we've actually gone backwards. We've invested billions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars. But when you look at it nationally, we've actually gone backwards. So for me, as an analyst, you go, where have all the dollars gone? What have we got for our billions of dollars, literally tens, if not close to $100 billion of taxpayers' dollars, and we end up with less affordable and social housing stock than we did 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. So that's a huge public policy failure.
But can I explain? I think it's not mismanagement. Actually, the money is not enough to maintain the properties that we have and to build new ones. It's not mismanagement. I have heard this argument from many Commonwealth colleagues. It's like, well, we're investing all this money. The reality is that the New South Wales government is the largest landlord in the Southern Hemisphere. So we currently have 120,000 properties. We are the largest landlord, but you need to invest. You cannot have a system that we had after the World War II where working people could access public housing in New South Wales. They could have the right to buy or they could pay higher rent, and that cross-subsidised the system. With the economic rationalist policies that were put in place by governments progressively from the 80s and 90s, the policy became, we're not going to invest in public housing or social housing, and we're going to target it to only the most vulnerable people in community who will only pay 25% of their income on rent. You cannot fund and operate a system without significant government investment. And that's why we've seen it going backwards, because the government investment wasn't enough, and the only way you can fund the system is to sell off. So if you believe, and I mean, I have to say, Adrian talked about health, education and housing as being the fundamental issues. What's the difference between those three policy areas? Housing is not considered a universal government policy. right? 57,000 people on the housing waiting list in New South Wales, the only government service you can be completely eligible for and never get a service in government. That says that our politicians and our community don't believe that housing is a human right that we have a responsibility to deliver. So unless we collectively agree that and start pushing our government to say, how are you going to go about doing that more efficiently, leveraging institutional capital investment, but government needs to be there, and we need to collectively as a society say, we believe people should be housed.
Next question. I should say that we must probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. One question, and then I'd suggest that we hit the speakers up while we're having a drink.
Hi, my name's Raja Jananka from Western Sydney University and UNSW as well. One of the things that you have to note is there's a housing crisis today, but it's been there for a long time. So it's not just happened yesterday or tomorrow or something like that. So I think this has been problematic in Australia for a long time, and we need systematic changes in policies. If you look at countries like Germany, there's a very small percentage of people who own their own homes. Here we try and generate ownership by giving them free gifts in the tax system, as has been said. So I think we need to think about changing that. There's a nice program on ABC last night which showed how under the current system what happens is when the big builders suddenly have a shortage of cash, the guys who get bashed down the line are the small guys. They're the guys who are cleaners, the electricians, the water plasterers, bricklayers, etc. And they get stuffed at this time of the year. It happens every time we have a cycle. The housing system goes through a cycle because the housing system gets affected by interest rates very significantly. We can't afford to buy a house, so we can't pay our mortgage because it's too expensive suddenly, and we have to quit, and so on and so on. So anyway, that's something important to worry about. Thank you.
Thank you, Medy. Andrew Stabak from Ethical Capital Partners. Fantastic panel discussion tonight. Some very, very valid points, extremely valid points raised, but we've spent most of the night talking about the problem and not a lot about the solution. And it amazes me that here in Australia we look overseas, where most of the world's problems are, and we can't see solutions that are born and have been going on in other countries in a far greater scale, and they're coming up with solutions overseas right now. Paris has 25% of its city dedicated to social and affordable housing. Singapore is 90%. And there's no lack of money. The world is awash with money. It's just how do we get a much more sophisticated and intelligent solution to the problem that we have here in Australia that they've been dealing with for 30 or 40 years overseas. Now, we've met most of you. Adrian, we've met already, and Medy, we've met. And there are solutions that we can bring in from overseas, but also there are unique situations here in Australia. So how do we do that? It's clear that the private capital or the private sector is limited in the solutions it can provide because of that return on investment. They're going to put their money where they're going to get the best return. So that's going to be largely in the private sector. So we need government support, we need government policies. We've already discussed that tonight. So how do we do that? Surely creativity and a little bit of innovation go a long way to solving this problem. But the point I'm getting to is that we can come up with those solutions. The return can be there with a little bit of support from government. So it's about putting our collective heads together to come up with solutions that will give the private capital, which can be here in Australia, but also can come from overseas because that's already being done now, to that solution. So how do we create the right return, the stability, and the ability for this asset class, and it is an asset class if you're going to be calling in investors, to come up with long-term solutions to bring affordable housing to people that need it with a little bit of government support. I think we need pilots. And therefore, what I'm asking for is can collectively in this room and the sector come up with pilots to come up with solutions to put gap back to not only government, but more importantly, that investment class that will support this sector in the long term, because that's what's been done overseas, and it's been done overseas for 30 or 40 years. Adrian, you mentioned mentioned it, since the Second World War. These are solutions.
Look, that's a great question. That's a big question. Certainly,
I think that Adrian could well and truly talk. We've done pilots, believe me.
So just conscious of time, that is a fantastic question. Adrian, do you
All
want
I
to have
would say on that is it gets back to politics first, okay? Because the whole regulation, whether it's government investment, whatever it is, we've got a crisis. We've got market. The market is not acting rationally at the moment, and so when a market's not acting rationally, you have to get government to step in, and it needs to start. And as I said earlier, it gets back to getting at the federal level. If we can't get the three parties on the same page, and then you've got the states not on the same page because they're all going off in different tangents, it's got to start with leadership, which Wilhelm touched on, and it's got to start with government at the moment to set a framework to allow these things to occur, so we can get the capital in to partner with government. And we have been piloting things, and we did it at NIFIC with the bond aggregator. We got the Housing Australia Future Fund, which the first round will be announced in September. These things are just touching the sides of what's really needed, but you've got to get leadership from the government. Canada's doing it. They've got a national housing plan, and they're setting a framework in place that allows all parts of the housing ecosystem to work collectively together to come up with a range of solutions.
Thanks so much, Adrian. I'll pass back to Peter.
Well, thank you, Medy, and thank you, Wilhelm, and Rebecca, and Sue, and Adrian for what has been a fascinating, but I've got to be honest, pretty disheartening discussion. I suppose I learned three things as a public servant about crises. First of all, we often talk about crisis. This is a genuine crisis. We use the term too much. First thing, Raja was right. Most crises don't usually just emerge. They take decades of poor public policy to really get to this situation, and that's what we have done. The second thing, which we didn't mention tonight, is once you've got a crisis like this, the tentacles of that crisis spread, distorting other public policy. Just think, for example, of the approach we're going to now take on reducing skilled migration, or putting caps on international students as a so-called solution to the housing crisis, without thinking through what are the other implications of that. The third thing that I did discover is that whenever you talk about issues like this, usually someone looks at this complex problem and has a simple solution. I'm so glad we didn't hear one tonight, because those simple solutions we know are always wrong. So I do want to thank all you speakers on the way you've run this, Medy. I mean, we've covered a whole range of issues, macro, micro. It is clear that if we are going to successfully address this nationally and in New South Wales, it's going to require a range of interlocking policies to be able to do it. There isn't going to be a single solution, and that it can't be government alone. It's got to be government working with business, working with the community sector to make it work. So thank you. I think you've given us a real insight to the challenge we face. It was a great evening.